So for this week on Cyber School, we're talking about ADA compliance and cyber data and how you can just incorporate that into your mass notification system. It's an important topic as more people are coming back to the workforce. And, just with, honestly, an aging population, more people are going to encounter ADA necessities in their daily life, whether it's lack of vision as you get older. Your vision deteriorates and you might need other forms of getting some kind of notification, or get wheelchair bound, or something that happens as people age. And ADA compliance is just more and more important as we've got an aging populace. So let's talk a little bit about what ADA is in the first place. Well, it stands for the Americans with Disabilities Act, and it was a federal law enacted in 1990. And it basically prohibits discrimination against those with disabilities. And that could be discrimination, of course, in the workforce, but also as, a customer or patron, or just general discrimination against anybody with a disability. And that requires, of course, employers and businesses to make reasonable accommodations for different employees and visitors or patrons to a particular location, whether that's, of course, the people that'll be working in a specific location, or people that'll visit it, or, people that have to come to a specific building for services, something say like the DMV, something where you're not really going and you're not choosing to be a patron there. You kind of have to go there. Basically any building has to have some level of ADA compliance, with the exclusion of homes, and personal domiciles don't really have to comply with ADA. So where's this ADA actually complied? Of course, it's, in one place that we run into it in our everyday lives, of course, business infrastructure. And you'll notice that, as you're going out to say, any big box stores, or, any government buildings, or even, your place of work, there's things like ramps and stairs. Anywhere that there might be stairs, there's probably a ramp for somebody with wheelchair access to be able to gain access to a facility. Things like handrails are also going to be very important in places where there are stairs. Handrails are usually paired with that kind of thing. Of course, one thing that we always know for, ADA is handicap parking spaces, in the front of every building, where you get that little, stick guy in a wheelchair. Everybody knows those blue placards. But it also comes down to, the actual width of doors, and how wide a door can be. So that way somebody that is wheelchair bound can get through it. And of course, slope angles. All these really kind of boring civil engineering things are all big parts of ADA compliance. But other things like signage are also covered with ADA, and that's specific typesets and fonts that can be used, size, and then of course Braille, so that way people that are vision impaired or sight impaired have the capability to understand what might be on a sign. But for the purposes of what we're talking about today, it also has to do with notification and IP-based devices. And two common things that come into play with IP-based notification equipment is going to be your actual intercom mounting height, and then the strobe color and brightness in certain use case scenarios. So why is ADA compliance important now that we kind of understand a little bit about it? Well, first and foremost, it's the law. So, any business that is going to have employees visit it or patrons visit it, you have to abide by those laws. And if you don't abide by the laws, you're going to get fined and you might get a lawsuit, and both of those can be very expensive. So it's in the best interest of those, businesses and, different offices to comply with ADA to prevent those lawsuits and prevent any fines. They can get ridiculously expensive, upwards of $75,000 per fine. And, they really can add up quickly, especially with something like, the width of specific doors. For every doorway that's not, the right size, that's $75,000. That can add up real quick. So it also just makes the workplace or a business a lot more inclusive. So that way, people that are, have some kind of a disability feel like they're welcome in that particular location. And that can bring about, of course, getting new customers, where people will specifically sort out places that are ADA compliant. Maybe they have a family member that might be, say, wheelchair bound, and they only go to places that, are easily wheelchair accessible. So that way they can bring that person there. But it also helps maintain that existing customer base, because people are only getting older. Nobody's getting younger. As the population ages, more people are going to have some of these ADA requirements, impact their daily lives. So it becomes super important to comply with ADA, but it's also a tax write-off. So, anything that you do to help modify your building or your workplace to make it more ADA compliant is something that you can write off for tax purposes. And it also becomes that marketing angle where you can say, hey, we just added a ramp because we wanted to be ADA compliant. You also write it off at the end of the year for all your tax stuff. So, everybody wins with that aspect. So, what kind of cyber data products and what IP products in general involve ADA compliance? Well, of course, one of the major ones that you'll run into is intercoms, because that's a two-way communication style device. It requires very specific mounting heights and other things specifically that we'll cover momentarily. But common instances of intercoms that you'll run into are, of course, indoor and outdoor, and then handwave intercoms are all going to have some kind of ADA compliance requirements with them. But then, of course, speakers for auditory notification and strobes for visual notification are the kind of examples of products that you'll run into that have some level of ADA compliance requirements. So when we're talking about an intercom installation and making that ADA compliant, of course, one of the best things that you can do, if it's included with your intercom, install a Braille label. So that way people that might be visually impaired, might not be able to see, can read the actual Braille on the label of the intercom and know that this is an intercom, and they can press that button for help. But there's also specific mounting requirements in terms of how high or how low the intercom can actually be mounted. An intercom must be mounted no higher than 48 inches above the floor, or I guess, as low as 15 inches above the floor. And that gives anybody that's wheelchair bound easy accessibility to reach that specific intercom. But forward reach is also important when you're talking about that kind of installation, where somebody that's wheelchair bound might only be able to reach, 48 inches out from where they're actually seated to be able to interact with that intercom. So the actual things that they'll have to interact with, for example, on, say, a CyberData intercom, the call button can be no higher than 48 inches above the ground, and can be the forward reach can be no more than 48 inches away. So say, for example, if it's in a recessed area, they shouldn't have to reach more than 48 inches to interact with that particular button. When you're dealing with these heights, it's, of course, the interactable unit on the particular device that they have to interact with. So the top of the intercom, the actual top of the threshold of the intercom can be above 48 inches. But for example, on our single button intercom, the actual push button itself can be no higher than 48 inches. So that way you can kind of set that as a marker as you're trying to figure out the actual installation height. And if you're installing anything on, say, like a gooseneck or a pole, most of those mounting devices that you can mount something to are usually ADA compliant. So if you mount it on one of those, you're pretty much good to go if you have one of those, say, gooseneck poles or exterior mounting poles. This is more relevant when you're, say, mounting something on a wall, say an indoor intercom, or actually on, say, a cinder block exterior of a building. So when you're dealing with mass notification and that kind of compliance, it's always good, whenever possible, to pair visual notification with that auditory notification. And it becomes super impactful in things like classrooms, auditoriums, or places where the ambient noise level might get a little high, and people that have hearing issues, or might be completely deaf, might have trouble hearing something. Even just in myself, dealing with different loud noises and stuff and getting a bit of tinnitus, it's always nice to have that visual notification of just some kind of an announcement going on. Even if I'm not completely hearing impaired, that visual notification is really good, because sometimes we all get into our phones and we're scrolling through Twitter, looking at the current news, and just seeing that big blinky light on the wall gets you to look up and hear that, hey, there's a fire drill in progress, everybody exit the building. You'll pay a little bit more attention just because there's that big blinky light on the wall. But when you're dealing with specific ADA compliance, visual notification actually has to illuminate white in very specific instances. Your strobes don't always have to blink white, but for things like emergency notifications, specifically for fire or carbon monoxide or just general smoke alarms, actually have to blink white. But for general notifications, say just a regular announcement or a drill, it can illuminate any color. But when you're dealing with specific emergency notifications, it has to blink white. That's actually in the specific requirements, actually to a specific candela that our devices meet as well. Whenever possible, or when applicable, you can also use text and graphical notifications. So that can be really powerful. Say if you've got digital signage and you have the capability to pass messages through that digital signage, that can also be part of that ADA compliance. It's of course not required, but if you have that capability, you can pass that through there. And just more notification is better when you're dealing with this kind of emergency notification. And the final thing when dealing with ADA compliance and mass notification, or really any telecom equipment in general, is it has to be tested on a regular interval. When this stuff is coming down to really giving these notifications for this emergency event going on, say a tornado warning or an earthquake, out here on the West Coast, knowing that critical infrastructure is functional is absolutely critical. And that's why ADA compliance requires the system must be tested on a regular interval, depending on the particular location and what that system does. General announcements, that kind of stuff, like a general overhead paging system, is going to be regularly exercised, but things that are a little bit more critical, say, a whole fire control system for a school is tested on a less regular interval just because of the logistics behind it, but it still needs to be tested, again, just because that's such an important mission critical item to your mass notification system. So finally, when we're dealing with CyberData and ADA compliance, you always want to install your included Braille labels. We include them in the box, so that way you can put them in there, and it just makes it easy to incorporate that ADA compliance when you buy any of our products. And whenever possible, pair your speakers with that visual notification, because it not only just increases the possibility for somebody to pay attention to those auditory notifications going out, but it adds in that ADA compliance for that emergency notification. And we have strobes available in indoor and outdoor varieties. So whether it's an indoor environment or an outdoor environment or an environment where things are going to get dirty and you want something that's IP66 rated, we've got a whole bunch of different options available. And when you're dealing with an intercom, you're of course going to want to mount it at the particular height that it needs to be. Again, 48 inches maximum height and 15 inches minimum height. And somewhere in that range is absolutely perfect. So that way anybody that is wheelchair bound has the capability to actually interact with that. And of course, you don't want to, put a cart or anything or a trash can in front of it. So that way people can't interact with the intercom. You're installing an intercom so that way people can interact with it in the event of an emergency. You don't want to block it. And then finally, you just want to test the system regularly. You're spending all this money on a mass notification system, and it's super important to just make sure that that critical infrastructure is functioning in the manner that you want it to be.
Thank you for watching this edition of Cyber School. If you have any questions, please get in contact with our sales department. They are available by email at sales@cyberdata.net or by phone at 831-373-2601 extension 334. Please make sure to like this video and subscribe for more content like this from CyberData.